So, before I get into this podcast properly, I just want to mention that I produce a number of articles on the website corporealfantasy.com, and I'm remiss for never putting that damn URL at the bottom of these podcasts. But corporealfantasy.com, I write things that typically I don't produce podcasts on, so I produced an article called "Should You Screw Everyone Over?" If you think the answer to that is yes, then you might be in for a surprise. Anyway, there are various articles on there that I don't do podcasts about, and you might find some of it interesting. So that's enough about that. I think I should probably put the corporeal fantasy thing on the intros to this, the website. Anyway, so here's an article that I've written recently that I have decided to produce a podcast on. The article's called "Turn the Sensitivity Down," but I think probably a more appropriate title might be "Don't Call Me Sensitive." I don't want to be sensitive, and hopefully by the end of this podcast you'll know why. So, if we look at the extreme sort of insensitive end of the scale, then if we look at a lump of rock, then it doesn't seem to exhibit many sensitivities. You can shout at it, pull faces, insult it, urinate on it, kick it, even say that its mother was a whore, and you will get absolutely no response. The only thing a rock understands, like some people it would seem, is extreme physical violence. Dynamite or a jackhammer. That's pretty much all that a rock understands. That's the extent of its sensitivity. You can do any number of things to a rock, but it's really only going to change and respond to its environment through extreme physical violence. Plants are a bit more sensitive. Deprive a plant of light, pull it out of the ground, or deprive it of water, and it will probably die. Plants are also susceptible to various diseases, parasites and predators. This sort of illustrates the point that the more sophisticated something becomes, more complex, the more it is likely to be affected by its environment, simply because it depends on its environment more. A rock really doesn't depend on its environment in any way, shape or form, other than extreme physical events. So we then get to animals, who respond to almost everything, and the more highly developed the sensibilities of an animal, the more there is for it to respond to. So, a dog will respond more to the environment than a worm. But having said that, a dog probably wouldn't respond to your roof leaking, or an eclipse of the sun, or someone's noisy radio somewhere nearby. They're probably not going to respond to that, whereas it may a noisy radio may drive you insane. So human beings will respond to the things that animals respond to, but of course animals don't have the kind of cognitive ability that we have, and they don't have language, and they don't have the ability to conceptualize in the way that we do. And so we have a whole domain of sensitivities that the animals don't have, particularly the ability to formalize and create ideas and to be motivated by those ideas. I'll come on to that in a moment. So all of this was summarized very nicely by Arthur Schopenhauer. He said, going through those three categories of inanimate objects, vegetative life, and animal life, he said that inanimate objects basically obey the laws of physics. So if you kick a ball on 10 occasions with the same force, everything being equal, then it'll go the same distance every time. You'd be very, very surprised if it didn't. The same thing with a space rocket. Load it with a certain amount of fuel and it will go into a certain orbit every time you load it with that same amount of fuel. This is the law of physics operating, and that applies to simple inanimate and actually complex inanimate objects as well. And then we get to vegetative life or plants, and these do not respond to in a deterministic way in the same way that inanimate things do. Plants respond to stimuli, and when the stimulus is removed, then the plant's response to it stops. So if you apply light to the leaves of a plant, then it will start busying itself with photosynthesis, but as soon as you remove the light source, then the photosynthesis stops. But this isn't a purely deterministic kind of relationship, because if you try and apply the light when the plant is near the end of its growing cycle, say, or the leaves are starting to die or something, then you're not going to get the same response from the plant. So because plants are more complex, then they will respond to a given cause in a very different way according to the situation that they're in, where they are in their growth cycle, for example. And then we get to animals. Animals and human beings are driven by motives. And of course we have vegetative life within us, so we are going to respond to stimuli, but the differentiator is that human beings and animals are driven by motives. So, for example, an animal will continue to run away from a predator even when it can no longer see the predator. So it sees a predator, there's some kind of stimulus, but then it has a motive. Oh my God, this thing's going to eat me. So it runs for 2 miles in the opposite direction for half an hour or however long. And in human beings, this thing of having motives is even more developed, because somebody may work for years to acquire a qualification, so they can get a job at the end of it, and they're not entirely certain they're going to get a better job, but they do it anyway. So they're motivated, and human beings are motivated by ideas. So someone may be motivated the whole of their life by religious ideas. So those are the 3 differentiators according to the 3 different levels of sensitivity. So sensibility. So inanimate objects have no sensibility, they just obey laws of physics. Plants and vegetative life respond to stimuli. They have no initiatives of their own, so to speak, they just respond to stimuli. And animals, right up to man, have varying degrees of motivation, which is a driver that derives from their own sense to some extent, and certainly that's the case with men. There is a rub in all of this, and the rub is that the more complex and sensitive a thing is, the more it will suffer. And there's several reasons for this. The legitimate needs of something will multiply with its complexity. So a rock needs absolutely nothing, whereas human beings need food, sleep, shelter, sex, mental stimulation, and so on. If any of these things are missing, that person will suffer. Of course, that's just a very basic list there. Maybe people need many more things than that. It's also the case that as something becomes more complex, there's more to go wrong. So various diseases and illnesses, and in man's case mental illnesses as much as physical illnesses, because our minds are so much more complex. And again, Schopenhauer summarized this all very nicely. He said that irritability is driven by sensibility. The more sensitive, the more you are able to perceive the environment and to consider the environment, the more you are likely to be irritable or irritated by things. So as the word suggests, to be irritable means to be irritated by something. A loud noise, an itch, someone's irritating habits, a stray muscle, slow traffic, a queue, mismatching decor, and on and on. So the more things we are able to sense and are sensitive to, the more things there are to irritate us. So nature has fine-tuned our sensibilities to such an extent that almost anything can irritate. There are two takes on this situation, and this is the important part of it. So, just to recap, as we go from inanimate objects through vegetative life, through to animals, through to human beings, so there are greater sensibilities, and so there is more room for us to be irritated by things. And I'm not talking about irritation in a trivial sense. Some horrible disease you would classify as an irritation, but obviously it's much more than that. Or mental illness, or whatever. Suffering, basically. Equate irritation with suffering. So the more complex and sophisticated creatures become, the more they can suffer. So there are two takes. One says that we are blessed to have such sensory and intellectual sensitivity, and we should make the best use of it. Appreciate nature, art, philosophy, ethics, music, physical activities of all kinds, and so on. But there's a problem with this. The problem goes like this. You can't eat the cookies without getting fat. So if you are hooked on aesthetic pleasures, you better be ready to accept aesthetic pain as well. Those people who are most hooked on looking good, for example, who are the most vain, are the people who are most easily offended by people who don't look good. And as it says in the Tao Te Ching, and I shall come to the Tao Te Ching shortly, the minute you say something is beautiful, you've created a whole world of ugliness, because you're differentiating. So, this idea that we are blessed by having these sensibilities and sensitivities is flawed, because it will lead us to much suffering. The more you develop your sensitivities to nature and so on, the more you are going to be disappointed by the things that don't come up to your aesthetic standards. So Lao Tzu had a solution for this, and I have to say that the idea of aesthetic appreciation, even though it's something that Schopenhauer harps on about quite a lot, it has no attraction for me personally. I vote for Lao Tzu. And in his work, the Tao Te Ching, he says, this is from verse 12, he says, the 5 colours can blind, the 5 tones deafen, the 5 tastes cloy, the race, the hunt, can drive men mad, and their booty leave them no peace. Therefore the sensible man prefers the inner to the outer eye. So those first 3 lines about the colours blinding, the tones deafening, the taste cloying, are essentially about sensory overload, about us being too heavily influenced by the sensory world. And then the race, the hunt, can drive men mad, and their booty leave them no peace, is all about motives. To be constantly motivated leaves us with no peace. And so the sensible man prefers the inner to the outer eye. Sensory overload wearies us. The overbearing motives leave us with no peace. To be constantly motivated and stimulated by the world is a curse, and the only course of action is to move toward the inner eye, as Lao Tzu says, an inner sense of the vast ocean of stillness within us. The world of phenomena is not a problem for a rock, but it is a problem for man, with his overload of sensory input and mental stimulation. So, treat the world as Lao Tzu advises. Treat it as a straw dog, something temporary and not really worth our attention.